the twisting mountain roads of the southern French Alps. A beautiful vista as they climb up through mountain passes like the Col de Cherini. One thing comes into mind for me: a fantastic opening sequence of a James Bond film and the roads down into the harbour at Monaco. In that famous opening sequence of the film, 007's Aston Martin goes wheel to wheel with the Ferrari of a secret Russian spy. It's an exciting challenge between Ferrari's latest developments and a highly tricked out and heavily modified Aston Martin. And coming into Monaco, Aston Martin has bought a heavily modified car. Well, let's take a look at some of those upgrades introduced to the Aston Martin last time out in Imola and reappearing here in Monaco. And for me, the most exciting thing appears right at the front of the car. This development of the front wing, something we haven't seen in this generation of cars before. It's a real innovation. Let's take a closer look, because the whole shape of the nose structure and the front wing, the upper elements of the front wing, have been completely revised. That nose structure change, the shape of the nose, has been changed as well. They've added this central element at the base of the nose tip. Now, those changes are not structural changes. The front impact structure underneath the skin of the nose remains the same, but the linkage point to the front wing and the centre section of the front wing has been revised completely, and everything on the outside is all new. But the bit that's really got me quite excited is this funny little notch on the upper two elements, the outer edge of the upper two elements of the front wing. And you can see what the team are sort of trying to do, at least what they're looking at, with these little notches in this on the upper flaps of the wing. And you can see that those notches are perfectly aligned with the edge of the front tyre, but also aiming inside this little aerodynamic element that all cars are featured with in the current generation of rules. And to take a look, or have a little bit of an explanation, though slightly cagey explanation, we spoke to Q himself, or at least if you're Fernando Alonso or Lance Stroll. Dan Fallows qualifies as Q.
You know, we're always interested in how the flow from the front wing interacts with the flow around the front tyres. That's quite a key element of the aerodynamics of the car, and it's all about trying to sort of maintain that relationship in the best possible way.
Fallows there clearly not shaken or stirred by the developments to his car. And let's compare that new front wing design with that revised upper surface to the old version the team had previously been racing with. And you can see that upper surface is smooth, very curved, almost a bit like the car that was very first launched in 2022, had a wing not dissimilar to this. Now you can see here on the leading edge of the nose tip, this is the old design of course, and the two link sections that link the leading edge of the front wing to the second element of the front wing. Of course, now on the new design, you only have one of those link sections here and then a central one. The number of link sections you can have is actually limited in the technical regulations. So Aston Martin playing around with that and really developing something that could be quite complex aerodynamically. But the whole package works all the way around the wing. Aston Martin are also experimenting with the shape of the front wing end plate. Now, these leading edges of the front wing end plates are something the teams have played around with before. Some teams have a slightly wobbly design. Other teams have done different things with the strake here, or the dive plane as some people call it. But what Aston Martin has been playing around with is the rear element of the end plate. And you can see it quite clearly here, that they've glued on an extension at the back of the end plate and extended the dive plane ever so slightly. Aerodynamics again around the front wheel is what they've been looking at there. And when you compare it to the previous version that Aston Martin used, you can see the rear of the end plate is quite sculpted and there's no protrusion of the dive plane. But you can see behind in this shot, you can see one of those wobbly front wing end plates of the Alpine team, and very different design of the strake on the outer edge of the front wing end plate. So Aston Martin clearly finding a bit of an advantage in their shiny new wind tunnel with this design of front wing. Of course, when you start at the front of the car, you have to move immediately rearward. And the most important part of the aerodynamic package of any of this generation of car is the floor and the underside of the floor. And the teams really don't like us looking at it, but coming into Monaco, there could be some spies around, whereas a driver has a little bit of a mishap out on track, they have their spy cameras ready to look underneath the floor as the car gets craned away. So keep an eye out for that all the way through. the Aston Martin mechanics will be doing everything they can to keep this new floor under wraps. Now this is the floor Aston Martin were using earlier in the season. You can see this element on the floor edge. Some people call floor edge wing. It's not. It's just a little extension here. And you can see quite clearly that this little section is fairly smooth, fairly simple, fairly constant edge. But if we look further forward on the floor to the more recent evolution of this car, you can see that edge section is completely different in its shape. And they've also introduced one of these now quite popular, I like to call them viaduct sections, because they look a little bit like a little piece of railway architecture, don't they? I just like those designs. That's all to do with managing the flow from the front of the floor up here, and then just bringing it through under the floor, just the team want to do it, and then generating the airflow underneath that brings as much downforce as possible. And that's super critical with these cars. Lots of teams experimenting in this area. Aston Martin now going the same direction as their engine supplier Mercedes, and that should be quite interesting. And speaking of Mercedes parts, of course, the rear end of the Aston Martin, the gearbox, the transmission casing, is also provided by the team in Brackley, the Silver Arrows. Though their cars haven't been silver until this year for a while, we can have a look because that defines a lot of elements around the rear suspension. And that rear suspension layout is a little bit governed by the Mercedes team. But even there, the team has been mucking about with the shrouds around the rear suspension, just trying to get as much airflow, doing as what they want around the rear of the car. You can just see these beam wings here and how they're interacting with the suspension. It's pretty obvious looking at this image, actually. I think it's quite a nice one to take a look at. And we're going to come back to those beam wings in a moment. But let's roll forwards to a different element of the car, because I want to look at the car from behind, and you'll see one of the interchangeable parts of the Aston Martin package, and all the teams are mucking about with these cooling areas. Have a look here, these interchangeable cooling louvres. This is something the team were mucking about with quite a lot in Imola, and I think we'll see a lot more change in Monaco as the weekend goes on, depending on the weather. If it rains a lot, you might see them closing them up because you don't need as much cooling when it's cool. But of course, when you close them up, you reduce the drag, you open up, you increase drag, but you also increase the cooling. And that could be a big factor on a low average speed circuit. Now, speaking of cooling, you've got to look at the rear brake ducting here. Now, this is a funny angle because you can't really see the rear brake scoops very clearly, but you can see where they sort of exist just on the inner face of this plate here on the inside edge of the wheel. Now this area of the car is super critical because keeping the airflow between the outer edge of the floor here and the inner edge of the tyre is really crucial to almost sealing the sides of the floor. Not quite a sliding skirt, but a sort of virtual skirt. And this is an area that teams have been playing around with ever since the invention of blown diffusers, all the way back with, I think it was the Red Bull RB6 was the first modern car to go that route. But the brake ducting itself, there is a zone of technical freedom where teams can actually muck about with what is and is not a duct. And this is to look at the Aston Martin rear brake package from Imola. And you can see they've added these little winglets on the inner face of those brake ducts. Now, these are really important. They clearly generate a little bit of downforce. You can see that from the shape. But the fact that they're acting on the brake duct and on the wheel directly means that's downforce acting directly on the unsprung mass. So that gives you a real advantage in terms of downforce generation. You're a bit limited to what you can do with it because putting downforce directly into the wheels was banned all the way back when Lotus was racing the Lotus 49 and those very first wings on big pillars and very tall stilts. There are a lot of accidents as a result of wing failures and cars flying off the road at places like Montjuic Park in Barcelona, and that resulted in putting downforce onto unsprung parts of the car. Well, a little bit illegal, but the rules allow what Aston Martin are doing here, and you'll see a huge amount of development on this area of the car up and down the grid. And you can see this is where all the hot gas comes out of the front brakes. They go through the caliper, goes through the discs, doesn't go through the pads anymore. That's no longer allowed. The rules were changed. But you can really see some of those design iterations. You can see these little winglets, how they sit around the rear suspension, how they work with other parts of the car. Really crucial part of aerodynamic development around the back of the car. Just another view of it here. You can really see how they interact, and the extra element down here as well. That's quite an interesting part, worth looking at, worth monitoring on other cars. So then we'll take another look around the rear of the car, and here you can see those beam wings. Again, this is earlier in the season. This is last time out in Imola. And you see Aston Martin have changed their rear beam wing design slightly. They've got a twin element design. They've been mucking around with that all year. And they've also got this cutout in the rear engine cover to increase cooling. They don't run that engine cover at every single Grand Prix. It depends on the demands. The other thing to keep an eye on is this little breather pipe just above the gearbox rear impact structure. That's something all cars have to have, but Aston Martin's is quite neat. This is sort of flat, elongated pipe that comes out and stops teams dumping used oil back into the combustion chamber and getting a slightly illegal power boost out of it. So all teams have these little breather pipes. I just think the Aston Martin one is quite neat, even though it's held on where it looks like a little cable tie that's been purchased from your local hardware shop. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't, maybe it's a sort of space age grade version, but actually the cost cap does have an effect, and there's probably nothing wrong with that piece of design anyway for what you want to use it for. But it's also just a nice little view of the diffuser here. You can see some of the edge elements that have been mucked about with by the team, and a little bit of development down here. Twin element on their unique sort of crash structure winglets, I guess we have to call them. That's something the team have been mucking about with, and I think everybody else is eventually going to copy. But it makes pit stops quite difficult as the jack comes in to the rear. And you can see how Aston Martin is studying the rear end of the car by the way they're mounting some of their airflow sensors. And you can see here the sensors are pointing very much in very distinct directions, trying to pick up what the airflow is doing. And you can see how they're pointing in ever so slightly different directions, and that's where they expect the airflow to be going as it comes rushing out of the diffuser and goes up into the air, and they try and study that effect. Another thing just to look at is this little channel that runs along the top of the crash structure. It looks like a nothing, but these little angles, they will have a small aerodynamic effect. It will work with how the exhaust gases are coming out, and that's again something Aston Martin has spent a lot of time and energy modelling on the rest of the car. Nice little shot here. You can just see inside that rear cooling structure, you can just see that they've blanked off that centerpiece that was open earlier on and had a solid section running up here, but the same shape is present. But you can just see some of those rear suspension parts, those dampers, those torsion bar springs, they're all just packaged there because they have to put them somewhere, but they do have an aerodynamic effect because the airflow under the body is also important. But as we get into Monaco, it's always worth looking at the rear wings on the car. Here's what Aston Martin were using earlier in the season. It's a fairly conventional rear wing. Aston has been one of the teams that have been playing around with it's sort of a remote rolled tip. They don't have this section here all the time. Notably, that section on the end doesn't link to the lower section on this iteration of the wing. But when we get into the Monaco specification wing, you'll see it's much bigger. It is like a barn door on the back of the car. And you can see how much more drag it's going to be generating, but also in theory, how much more downforce. Well, for Aston Martin to bring all of these upgrades to Monaco, it's something of a gamble. And if you want to know more about gambles taken at Monte Carlo, you don't need to go to the casino, you need to go to F1 TV, where Craig Scarborough, Bernie Collins and Tina Gade take a detailed look at how you roll the dice around the streets of Monaco. But for Aston Martin, all of these upgrades, they haven't worked immediately, have they? The drivers, Fernando Alonso, Lance Stroll, reported after the Grand Prix at Imola that the car was extremely difficult to drive. And having a car that's extremely difficult to drive on Formula One's hardest driver's circuit may not be a gamble that pays off. So it's a real roulette table for the team as they head out of Monte Carlo.